Nevada is roughly 85% federally owned land, more than almost any other state in the country, which means the vast majority of it is empty desert, restricted military range, or mountains that no city ever grew around. Scattered across what's left are some of the strangest small towns in the entire United States, a settlement built specifically to watch a secret military base that the government spent decades refusing to officially admit existed, a ghost town with a house built entirely out of 50,000 glass bottles, and a canyon so remote that the federal government uses its air quality as a national benchmark for what pure, untouched air actually looks like. This video counts down 9 real Nevada towns defined by genuine strangeness and isolation, documented in Nevada state historical records, county archives, and federal wilderness surveys. Several exist almost entirely outside cell phone coverage. More than one was built around an industry that no longer exists, in a location nobody would otherwise have any reason to visit. Stay with me to the end, because the final town on this list is named after a monster from Shoshone legend, was the site of the last stagecoach robbery in American history, and sits so deep in an isolated canyon that reaching it today still requires driving 50 miles of unpaved mountain road, the exact same journey it has always required. Let's begin. Rachel, Nevada, population somewhere around 50 people depending on the year, sits along State Route 375, a stretch of 2-lane highway the Nevada government officially renamed the Extraterrestrial Highway in 1996 in recognition of the town's unlikely claim to fame. Its proximity to the boundary of a restricted military installation most of the world knows as Area 51, the town's entire identity has organized itself around that neighbor. The Little Inn, Rachel's only restaurant, bar and motel rolled into one, has spent decades as the unofficial headquarters for UFO enthusiasts, curious tourists, and the occasional journalist making the long drive out from Las Vegas specifically to eat an alien burger and ask locals what they've seen in the night sky above the restricted base just over the mountains. The federal government did not formally acknowledge the existence of the facility near Rachel until a 2013 CIA document release, decades after the base had already become one of the most famous pieces of restricted land in the entire world, largely because of towns like Rachel keeping the story alive in the meantime. Rachel itself has no traffic light, no gas station reliably open at all hours, and a level of genuine physical isolation that has nothing to do with its neighbor. The nearest town of any real size is more than an hour away in any direction, across open desert where cell service disappears almost as soon as you leave the Little Inn's parking lot. It remains one of the only towns in America whose entire local economy exists specifically because of a military facility that for most of the town's history the government insisted did not exist at all. Here's a ghost town with a house built entirely out of trash, and it's somehow one of the most beautiful buildings in the entire state. Rhyolite, on the eastern edge of Death Valley, exploded into existence after gold was discovered in the surrounding hills in 1904, growing within just a few years into a genuine boomtown of several thousand residents, complete with a stock exchange, an opera house, and electric lights, remarkable infrastructure for a settlement sitting in one of the harshest desert environments in North America. The boom collapsed almost as fast as it arrived. By 1920, following a financial panic and the exhaustion of easily accessible ore, Rhyolite's population had dropped to nearly zero, leaving behind a genuine ghost town of stone ruins scattered across the desert. Among Rhyolite's most enduring structures is the Bottle House, built in 1906 by a miner named Tom Kelly using an estimated 50,000 discarded glass bottles, mostly beer and liquor bottles collected from the town's numerous saloons, mortared together into walls in a landscape where conventional lumber was scarce and expensive to transport. The house has survived for more than a century, restored at points along the way, and remains one of the most photographed pieces of Nevada ghost town architecture anywhere in the state, a monument built entirely from what an entire boomtown's worth of drinking left behind. Today, Rhyolite sits directly off the highway leading into Death Valley National Park, drawing a steady trickle of visitors who stop to photograph the Bottle House and the town's other stone ruins, including a bank building whose facade has become one of the most recognizable ghost town images in the American West, a settlement that existed as a real, functioning city for barely more than a decade before the desert reclaimed almost everything except what one man built out of glass. Before we go any further, here's the question worth asking. Why does Nevada in particular keep producing towns this strange and this isolated? The answer starts with a simple, staggering statistic. Roughly 85% of Nevada's entire land area is owned by the federal government, the highest percentage of any state in the country, encompassing military test ranges, national forests, wilderness areas, and vast stretches of undeveloped desert that will likely never see significant private development. That land ownership pattern concentrates Nevada's population into a small handful of urban centers, Las Vegas, Reno, and a few others, leaving enormous distances between them filled with almost nothing at all. Exactly the kind of empty terrain that both isolated mining towns and secretive military installations have found useful for entirely different reasons. Layered on top of that federal land pattern is Nevada's mining history, a boom and bust economic cycle that has repeated itself across the state for more than a century and a half, building towns almost overnight around silver, gold, or other mineral strikes, and then abandoning them just as quickly once the ore ran out, leaving behind the scattered ghost towns that define so much of rural Nevada today. Nevada's strangest towns, in other words, exist because the state's federal land ownership created enormous empty distances between population centers, and more than a century of mining booms and busts kept filling small pockets of that emptiness with towns that had no reason to exist once their original purpose disappeared. Cal Neve Ari sits in the Mojave Desert near the California and Arizona borders, a town whose very name announces the three states converging around it, founded in 1965 by a husband and wife team, Slim and Nancy Kidwell, who purchased the land specifically to build a private airstrip community around their own personal aviation hobby. The Kidwells constructed the town from scratch, including a hotel, a casino, and residential lots, specifically marketed to pilots who wanted homes with direct taxiway access to their own runway, an almost unheard-of arrangement even by Nevada's already unconventional small-town standards. The town's population has hovered around 300 people for years, many of them residents specifically drawn by the airstrip access that gives Cal Neve Ari its defining character. Private planes taxi directly from personal hangars onto public roads before reaching the runway, meaning aircraft and cars genuinely share the same streets in a way found in only a small handful of similar aviation communities anywhere in the country. The Kidwells ran the town's casino and hotel personally for decades, maintaining Cal Neve Ari as an unincorporated community entirely outside any municipal government structure. Cal Neve Ari remains, decades after its founding, a genuinely unusual hybrid, part retirement community, part aviation enthusiast enclave, sitting in some of the most remote desert terrain in the entire tri-state region. Its existence owed entirely to two people who wanted a place to keep their airplanes and simply built an entire town around that single idea. If you're finding these strange corners of Nevada as fascinating as we are, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Now, let's keep going. Goldfield, Nevada holds a title that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. In the early 1900s, at the height of its mining boom, Goldfield was briefly the largest city in the entire state of Nevada, with a population estimated at more than 20,000 people, dwarfing Las Vegas and Reno combined at the time and supporting multiple newspapers, a stock exchange, and grand stone buildings constructed with the confidence of a city that expected to remain permanently significant. The gold ran out with the same speed that defined so many Nevada boomtowns, and Goldfield's population collapsed dramatically over the following decades, further devastated by a catastrophic fire in 1923 that destroyed a significant portion of the town's remaining structures. What survived is a strange architectural mismatch that visitors still notice immediately. Grand early 20th century stone buildings, including a still-standing three-story hotel and an ornate county courthouse, sitting among a population that has dwindled to a few hundred people, structures built for a city of 20,000 now serving a town that could fit inside a single school gymnasium. Goldfield remains, remarkably, the seat of Esmeralda County despite its tiny population, still governing a stretch of rural Nevada from inside a courthouse originally built for a boomtown that vanished almost a century ago. One of the clearest physical illustrations anywhere in the state of just how dramatically Nevada's mining era ambitions outran what the desert was actually able to sustain over the long term. Beatty, Nevada, sits at a genuinely strange geographic and historical crossroads. It serves as the primary gateway town for visitors entering Death Valley National Park from the east, while simultaneously sitting just down the road from Yucca Mountain, the federally studied and ultimately never used site selected in the 1980s to become the nation's permanent underground repository for high-level nuclear waste. The town's population, hovering around 1,000 residents, has spent decades in an unusual economic position shaped by two very different neighbors, a booming national park drawing tourists from around the world on one side, and a controversial, politically stalled federal nuclear project on the other, one that promised significant local economic investment for years before Congress effectively defunded it in 2011 without ever resolving the underlying question of where the country's nuclear waste should permanently go. Beatty residents and local officials spent years testifying at congressional hearings and federal proceedings specifically about Yucca Mountain, a level of direct engagement with federal nuclear policy that few towns of Beatty's size anywhere in the country have ever had to develop. Beatty today functions primarily as a practical stopover for Death Valley visitors, its hotels and gas stations serving a tourist economy that has proven far more reliable than the nuclear waste facility that for decades always seemed like it might eventually transform the town's fortunes in one direction or another, and never quite did either. Gerlach, Nevada, a town of roughly 100 permanent residents at the edge of the Black Rock Desert, spends 51 weeks of the year as one of the quietest, most overlooked settlements in rural Nevada, and 1 week transforming into the closest thing to a functioning town for the tens of thousands of people who descend on the surrounding playa for Burning Man, the massive annual arts and counterculture festival that has grown from a small beach gathering in the 1980s into one of the most recognized cultural events in the entire country. For the rest of the year, Gerlach exists as a genuinely isolated high desert community sustained historically by a gypsum processing plant and more recently by tourism connected to its unusual annual neighbor, sitting more than 100 miles from Reno along roads that see little traffic outside of festival season. The Black Rock Desert surrounding Gerlach is itself one of the largest and flattest playas in North America, a landscape so vast and empty that it has been used for multiple land speed record attempts, including runs that established some of the fastest speeds ever achieved by a vehicle on land. Gerlach's relationship with Burning Man has become genuinely complicated over the decades, bringing significant economic activity and national attention to a town that would otherwise remain almost entirely unknown, while also straining a tiny permanent population's infrastructure and patience with a single week of activity that dwarfs the rest of the town's entire year combined, a trade-off residents have debated publicly for years without any clean resolution. Unionville, Nevada, tucked into a canyon in the Humboldt Range, briefly hosted one of the more famous residents in Nevada mining history. Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, lived in Unionville for a short period in 1861 while trying his hand at silver prospecting, an experience he later wrote about extensively, and with considerable self-deprecating humor in his memoir Roughing It, describing his own comprehensive failure as a miner in vivid detail. The town Twain briefly called home once supported a population in the thousands during its silver mining peak, complete with its own newspaper and the full infrastructure of a genuine boomtown, before the ore played out and Unionville collapsed to a tiny fraction of its former size, much like dozens of other Nevada mining settlements from the same era. What makes Unionville distinct today is its almost total lack of modern development. The canyon remains home to only a small handful of year-round residents, several of them living in restored historic buildings with no gas station, no store, and a level of quiet that visitors specifically seek out precisely because so few other places in Nevada have preserved it this completely. Unionville survives today largely as a curiosity for Mark Twain enthusiasts and Nevada history buffs, willing to make the drive down a remote canyon road, specifically to see where one of America's most famous writers spent a brief, thoroughly unsuccessful chapter of his life trying to strike it rich, a footnote to literary history sitting quietly in one of the most overlooked corners of the entire state. Garbage, Nevada is named after a monster. The town's name comes from an anglicized version of a Western Shoshone word describing a legendary creature said to live in the canyon, a giant who carried off travelers in a basket, a story significant enough to the region's earliest indigenous inhabitants that when gold was discovered here in 1909, English-speaking prospectors adopted a version of the same name for the boomtown that followed, launching what historians now recognize as the last major gold rush in the continental United States, arriving decades after the rest of the American West had already been thoroughly prospected. The town's early history produced two genuinely remarkable footnotes in American criminal history. Garbage was the site of the last recorded stagecoach robbery in the United States, and the subsequent murder investigation became the first American criminal case in which a bloody fingerprint was successfully used as evidence to identify and convict a suspect, a genuine milestone in the history of forensic science emerging from one of the most remote mining camps in the entire country. The gold eventually ran out, as it always did across Nevada, but unlike so many of the state's other boomtowns, Garbage never fully emptied out. Today, Garbage holds somewhere between 12 and 50 year-round residents, depending on the season. And who's counting, reachable only by 50 miles of dirt road that regularly closes entirely during winter months. With no cell service anywhere in the canyon and air quality the federal government has used as a national benchmark for pure, unpolluted air. It remains, by most honest measures, the single most isolated town in the continental United States, a place residents describe, without much exaggeration, as somewhere you have to genuinely want to reach, because nothing about the 50-mile dirt road in is going to make the decision easy for you. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with us through the full story of Nevada's strangest and most isolated towns. If you found these places as fascinating as we did, please consider subscribing. We cover more of America's hidden and remarkable places every week, and we'd love to have you along for the next one.